Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue to Myths and Mysteries of the Bastille. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French with the Alliance Française. Stay tuned for a couple of great events that we have coming up in September. On the 14th, we're going to welcome Jacques Pépin to come and have a déjeuner with us. And then on December 9th, we have Adrienne Leeds, who is one of our favorites, on how to retire in France. So we have a couple things on the calendar, but there will be more in the interim. A few logistics. Please stay on mute during the presentation. Stay on speaker view. All questions should be put in the chat that we'll talk about after the presentation. And if you have technical issues, please sign in after a couple of minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime is 1 hour. Roger Mummert is a writer and photographer whose writing on culture and travel has been published in the New York Times and elsewhere. Creator of the ParisProject.net, an experiential resource for appreciating Paris as a city of ideas. This is Roger's second presentation for us, so I'm really honored and thrilled to welcome Roger Mummert. Je vous donne la parole.
Well, merci et bienvenue. We're about to explore an event that happened 234 years ago tomorrow. An event that, while subject to varied interpretation and shrouded in symbolism and legend, is regarded as the beginning of the French Revolution and the foundation of modern France. It's also an event that relates very directly to social and political issues today. So please post some great questions about that in the chat. Again, I thank the Alliance Française for making this possible. I enjoyed our previous program, which can be seen on YouTube, and this will as well. And please visit my website, theparisproject.net, and sign up for a free monthly newsletter. And now, welcome to Myths and Mysteries of the Bastille, plus a few facts, legends, allegories, deconstructions, and interpretations. If you ask most Americans about the Bastille, you'll probably get one of three responses that shows something of how the Bastille is perceived here. Okay, the first, the revolution began here. The people will say, oh, the French Revolution, that began like when the people stormed the Bastille and released all the prisoners, and then they rose up and dumped that lousy king, right? Well, that perception is a beginning, let's say. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 was indeed a seminal event in the French Revolution, but the revolution hardly began with one blow. In 1789, France was years into widespread uprisings about feudalism, the class system, taxation, and the rising cost of bread. The Ancien regime was crumbling. The Bastille was a massive medieval fortress at the city's eastern gate, and it was emblematic of the despotism of that old order. But by 1789, it was essentially obsolete as a prison, slated for demolition. Only 7 inmates resided there. It was used more as a garrison, housing troops and storing ammunition. And on that day, July 14, a swelling crowd of Parisians marched on the Bastille to seize that ammunition. The crowd demanded that the governor, or warden, and his troops surrender. The governor refused, and there was a standoff, an unsuccessful negotiation, and then a short but bloody confrontation. The insurgents, 900 strong, prevailed. They were mostly workers from the surrounding neighborhood, joined by soldiers who defected to the revolutionary side. The crowd overtook the Bastille. They killed some of the defenders and captured the governor. They marched him off to justice at the Hôtel de Ville. He got there, but not in one piece. When the governor thrashed about and demanded his own death, the mob obliged him. Then they cut off his head and placed it on the end of a pike and marched on triumphantly. And that image, both inspiring and revolting, became synonymous with the myth of the revolution and the triumph of citizens united in the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity, forging their own new future. And in many depictions of this event, the Bastille looms large in the background. Perception number 2. The revolution The revolution began here was 1, the Bastille exists. Oh, I really want to see that prison when I get to Paris. Where is it exactly? Oh, je suis désolé, le Bastille n'existe pas. In the months following the storming, the Bastille was reduced to rubble, literally smashed apart. The demolition became a popular attraction with souvenirs and paid tours. Sections of the Bastille's stone walls were carved into miniatures of the former prison. These apostles of liberty were sent all over France to be placed in town squares to symbolize the people's triumph over tyranny. The location of the Bastille became La Place de la Bastille. In subsequent decades, there were multiple monuments placed there to commemorate the storming. In 1840, the massive Colonne de Juillet, which stands there today, was raised and dedicated to not the storming of the Bastille, but another uprising, the July Revolution of 1830. There are today a few vestiges of the Bastille. Part of its foundation was discovered in 1899, picture at the center, when tunnels were dug for the Paris Metro. These stones were moved nearby to the square Henri Galli, and also a few relics are displayed in the Bastille subway station. But you can see outlines of the original towers traced in the Rue Saint-Antoine, where the street meets the Place. And if you visit, go Thursday or Sunday, there's a food and flea market, the Marché Bastille. But there is no Bastille prison to be seen nor toured. It's been called the world's most referenced place that doesn't exist. Perception number 3, Bastille Day is an awesome party. Dude, I'd love to be in Paris for Bastille Day. Must be awesome. I actually know the person that would say these 3 things, but that's my invitation. Well, on Bastille Day, there is a party, but no Bastille Day. In France, it's officially called Fête Nationale Française. But in France, the national holiday is called 14 Juillet, in the same way we say 4th of July and not Independence Day. Well, notably, the Fête Nationale was not celebrated for the first century of modern France. The holiday was established in 1880. Today, 14 Juillet is marked with a military parade down the Champs-Élysées, fireworks, concerts, parties. And there's also a people's event at the actual site. And participants usually protest government policies, racism, state tyranny, and the original spirit of the revolution. One contemporary note I saw in Le Monde today that many of these celebrations in surrounding suburbs and some of the small towns are being canceled for fear of violence that's broken out over the recent incident of a 17-year-old in the Paris suburb of Nanterre who was shot by police. So there will be a focus this year on the racism in the so-called invisible suburbs in French society, where many immigrants and people of color reside. There is a notable comparison here. The storming of the Bastille over 2 centuries ago, as we're about to find, was led by workers from a Paris suburb, most of them recent immigrants to Paris from the countryside. And so we're left with this: Bastille, fact or myth? Let's talk about perceptions. The Bastille was seen as a prison, a place of unspeakable torture and neglect. It was filled with dungeons, with political prisoners. There were skeletons everywhere. There were instruments of torture. It was teeming with vermin, with standing water and disease. And it was a symbol of callous state despotism. In reality, by 1789, the Bastille as a prison was not much of a prison. It was more of a garrison housing troops and storing ammunition. It was considered outmoded and marked for demolition. It was expensive to maintain and was kind of a white elephant. There were plans to tear it down and put a large place there that's kind of like the place that's there now. In 1789, the number of inmates had dwindled to just 7. They included 4 counterfeiters, 1 lunatic assassin, and 2 sex offenders who were committed by their own family. The storming of the Bastille was, according to historians now, really just a symbolic victory. The Paris insurrection already had been won earlier in that day when the people of Paris had secured weapons at Invalides and the royal soldiers did nothing to intervene or stop them. There's no indication that the crowd that massed at the Bastille knew about that, but they've been described as really a symbolic victory after a true turning point when the hearts and minds of the soldiers and the people was secure. Yet, the Bastille remains a universal metaphor, a depiction of despotism of state and citizens who were denied the due process. Okay, I'm sorry. Hit the wrong thing there and jump to the end. We're not there yet. And so the Bastille is an idea. more than an actual building. It is a metaphor. And let's talk about it in terms of a couple of historians who have some very interesting things to say. Let's begin with Alexis de Tocqueville in his famous book, The Old Regime of the French Revolution. He writes in 1856 about the significance of the Bastille and the French Revolution itself. He said that no nation has ever before embarked on so resolute an attempt as that of the French in 1789 to break with the past, to create an unbridgeable gulf between all that they had hitherto been and all that they now aspired to be. In other words, when the next day came and Parisians and the French woke up after the seizing of the Bastille, they were waking up to a very new reality, and anything after that would be different from all that came before. Writing more in contemporary times is Robert Darnton in an essay, What Was Revolutionary About the French Revolution in 1989. He says that at the moment of the taking of the Bastille, there was a conviction that the human condition is malleable, not fixed, and that ordinary people can make history instead of suffering it. He said further that to the stormers of the Bastille, the world now appeared as a tabula rasa, ready to be redesigned. Speaking sometime later than the event, in 1882, the historian Ernest Renan gave a lecture at the Sorbonne called What is a Nation?, in which he describes this birthing of a nation that began with the storming of the Bastille and the French Revolution. And he said that, in definition, a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. A heroic past with great men and glory is the social capital upon which the national idea rests. And boy, there was plenty of social capital from the storming of the Bastille. Renan said further that the essence of a nation is that all its individuals have many things in common, and also that everyone has forgotten many things. That's an interesting thing to think about, that there's a commonality here, but there's also a forgetting. What was the depiction of the storming? Bear in mind that in 1789, Paris consisted of somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million people. Hard to know because the city was filled with a great many migrant workers who were forced there in search of work, in search of bread, in search of survival from the countryside. And half of them in the city were said to be illiterate, even a higher number in the countryside. So the image of the Bastille and the actual event itself was really very critical. And there was, right after the storming, a flowering of depictions of this happening in political broadsides that served to try and shape the narrative of what happened that day, July 14th. And it's interesting to, first of all, look at the crowd of people in the lower left. Looks like a ragtag bunch of people. They are joined by more in the center. By the lower right, we see the troops coming in, and it looks like thousands of people that are storming the Bastille. And at the top right, we see the leader of the Bastille being a woman raising a sword. So look also at the size of the Bastille and how it's almost like a person or a creature of great menacing creature. At the lower left, perhaps this is most realistic. The Bastille was at most 72 feet in height, and they say peaked out a little bit above the roofs of the houses nearby. The Bastille grows a great deal by the center. By the lower right, the Bastille is an enormous fortress, like an iceberg coming at the Titanic or something. And these were very interesting depictions that helped to tell the story and shape the narrative. Here's another depiction why the Bastille matters. But here, the Bastille is back to being essentially a two-story building, and the people are scaling it, and there's rifles, and there's a whole host of cannon being fired. This is not at all a realistic image of the depiction, but rather, again, a shaping of the narrative. But this triumph of the people, why is it important? Well, first of all, the storming of the Bastille shows that it was the power of les peuples menus. The people who stormed the Bastille were really people from the neighborhood. They were working people. And there were no revolutionary leaders there. The revolutionary elite missed the event. This was a truly organic event of workers from the neighborhood who rose up with sticks, basically. Some of them had rifles and so forth, and wore down and won over those who were guarding the Bastille. It was not a great battle. It was, once they entered, they say, the crowd had pretty much battered their way through an open door. So these depictions of this heroic kind of event are a little bit embellished. But key to this is the fact that the soldiers united with the people. This, as I said, was the hearts and minds of all the people were now one against the Ancien regime. And it was a display of fraternité, the brotherhood of man, it's sometimes called. And this concept, one of the three main concepts of the revolution, is one that we don't really have so much in the United States. And people really kind of stumble over this, the idea of fraternité. And we could discuss this at length, but the ideas of brotherhood came through in the insurgents, or the stormers of the Bastille. A lot of these people worked together. They were part of guilds or working associations, or were often called corporations. They were part of trades and so forth. There were brotherhoods there, but what there was not was a brotherhood between classes. Now, the people in the crowd were almost entirely of the working class, the working urban poor, and also shopkeepers and bourgeois were part of it. Surely the nobility was not. But in this moment, the stormers of the Bastille knew that the citizens held the levers of change, and this, as we said, was a complete break with the past. Now, what the Bastille continues to mean is that it's a lasting and universal metaphor for, as we said, tyranny and the people's struggle over it, justice over despotism, a fortress taken by the people, and fraternité, and also the notion of patrie. This is something very much in the news, whether fraternity sort of wins out over patriotism and so forth. We can get into that a little bit further. This cartoon, it has about 3 or 4 layers to it. I'm not sure I understand all of them. It's from Le Canard Enchaîné in 1986, and it shows President Mitterrand and his first minister or prime minister, Chirac, and the cohabitation is describing a situation in the 80s when they had a kind of a shared power. And it didn't go particularly well, but here's Mitterrand, who was known to be rather imperious. He's dressed as a sans-culotte there, with the sabot and the striped pants. I'm sure that got quite a chuckle, where Chirac is dressed more like a noble, it appears. And they're marching along in front of the Bastille, and they've got heads on pikes. Oh, well, Mitterrand has Chirac's head, and Chirac has Mitterrand's head, it so appears, and they're singing a song, Ah, sera, ça ira, ça ira. This was the revolutionary chant. It was not heard at the Bastille, but shortly thereafter, it became the official chant of the revolution. Oh, ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. It'll be fine, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. The people on this day repeat over and over, in spite of the mutineers, everything shall succeed. This was the spirit of the day. Now, notably, there was a sans-culotte version that said it'll be fine as soon as the aristocrats are hanging from lampposts. That was a different take on that. And there was still another version that said it'll be fine when the, how does it go, the clergy apologize for being so rich and the aristocrats say mea culpa. Interesting how this spirit of togetherness, of fraternité, was really a work in progress, and was not easy to bridge between the classes that were so stratified and established in French society. The mottos of the revolution, of course, were very critical. We know them today. We see the liberté, égalité, fraternité on the outside of every government building, every school, truly all over Paris, carved in stone, and a constant reminder of the tripartite values of the revolution. Here's some other variations of that. You see that there were other terms that were thrown in here: justice, reason, a few other variations, and liberté, égalité, fraternité, ou la mort, or death, was commonly heard there. There are several people that lay claim to having come up with the tripartite saying. One was Antoine Francois Mormoro, who was a printer who claimed to have put that into print, and also Camille Desmoulins, who's pictured there at the lower right, one of the revolutionaries who whipped the crowd up into a frenzy just before the storming of the Bastille. Also, there's Mayor Pache of Paris, who in 1792 inscribed the motto on all public buildings. As we said, you see them there today. One thing that changed, well, everything changed with the revolution. That includes language. They said there was a revolutionary psychology. We talked today about wokeness. And I tell you, Governor DeSantis in Florida never knew wokeness like there was wokeness after the revolution and during the reign of terror and so forth. The very term revolution was a new one, and it bewildered even the king. When he was told of the storming of the Bastille the next morning, he said to one of his ministers, "So it's a revolt?" He was told, "No, sire, it is a revolution." That was a term certainly understood, but used mostly to describe celestial bodies revolving around the earth. It was not a term in politics. Well, it was now. All the terms of the Enlightenment sometime came to the fore also. The social contract that was described by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The word citizen was in everything. There was a informalness that came. Vous was not used where tu could be used. When you left a meeting with a friend, you didn't say, see you later. You said, salut et fraternité. Street names were renamed to take out the word royal or Louis. Baby names were changed. In fact, you didn't name your son Louis or your daughter Louise. You named them something revolutionary like République or Liberté. And of course, there was the revolutionary calendar, which changed the months and the work week. Everything was different the day after the storming of the Bastille. Let's look at the history of what is also known as 232 Rue Saint-Antoine. Amazingly, it had an address. It was constructed and began in 1370 as a fortress that was meant to fortify the eastern gate of Paris. If you look in the center, that perhaps shows the whole layout. And some years later, where you see the gate into Paris, and beside it is the looming Bastille, and then a bâtiment that was added to the front of that, where it was fortified. It was used somewhat as a state prison, but it was really a fortification, a defense of the city. The British captured it for a while, and its second phase of use, though, really came during the time of Louis XIII and Richelieu, and he converted it to a state penitentiary where people were sent to be detained and removed from society. That really hit the big time under Louis XIV, who used the Bastille and other prisons with great frequency, and it went like this. It was also kind of a detention place for nobility. You might say sort of a country club prison. And it went like this for the nobility at court or were, in society. They were approached by a messenger who would tap them on the shoulder with a white baton. As they turned, they were served with a lettre de cachet. That's literally a letter under royal seal. It's a letter signed by the king and one of his ministers, and it stipulated that you were immediately under arrest. You were escorted to a waiting carriage. Curtains were drawn. You were taken to the inner courtyard of the Bastille. At this point, all the guards would turn to the wall. You would not be seen coming in. You were escorted into the Bastille, and your lodgings depended very much on your status and what your offense might have been. They varied a great deal, as we're going to see. The Bastille was converted somewhat to a military garrison in 1711, at the end of Louis XIV's reign. And for the rest of the century, under Louis XV and Louis XVI, its role changed to one that was more or less dictated by many police. The Paris police were ascendant in power during that period. And the Bastille became a place where a lot of people were taken because they had published things that were objectionable, or they had published without royal permission, something called the royal permission was called blanking on it right now, but they were offensive to somebody at court, and they were sent to the Bastille to kind of cool their heels until the monarchy decided that they could come out. And of course, in 1789, the raising of the Bastille removed it from the face of Paris. Also here at the left, you see some Jansenists, some Protestants being brought in here and stored. That happened in great incident under Louis XIV. The Jansenists had had a phenomenon called convulsionism. And these convulsionaires would quake with a religious fervor. They were thought to be absolutely insane. They were brought here, and the convulsionaires are there quaking, as it were, out in the courtyard. We see at the bottom the architect and the plans for the Place Louis XV. In other words, the king would have had his own place. It wouldn't have been Place de la Bastille. It was to be dedicated to Louis XV, the provider of liberty. Some irony in that. And then, of course, there's the storming of the Bastille and its immediate or almost immediate demolition, as you see at the right. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's go to the terminology of the Bastille. As you can see, the Bastille was never built as a prison. It was built as a medieval embattlement. And as such, it had 8 different towers that were united by a curtain wall. And it was not particularly commodious to being a prison. There were defenses at the top of the towers, and there were rooms carved out or created within the towers. They were called calottes. The rooms just at the top, underneath the crenellated ceiling or a roof area, were considered rooms you didn't really want. They were for prisoners of hardship. They were very hot in the summertime. They were very cold in the wintertime. You wanted a calotte somewhere in the middle. There were also cachots, or underground cells, and it is debatable whether there was something else, an oubliette, a bottle dungeon. Oublier is, of course, to forget. And if you see at the top right, a kind of funnel-like structure that was thought to be a cell where someone was taken and then dropped down into the bottom and simply forgotten about till they were dead. On historical inspection, it seems that was not the case. They were really cisterns, but that was part of the myth, the many myths of the Bastille. Imagine also, if you will, at the bottom right, you see the outdoors of the Bastille. In addition to being a prison, it was also a kind of a little village with marketplace, shops. There was a very nice warden's or governor's mansion there. There were gardens, there were walkways, and some of the inmates were allowed to go around at will. The first guest of the Bastille, ironically, was Hugh Aubriot. Ironic because he was the provost under Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, and he was the builder of the Bastille. He ended up being its first prisoner. He was said to be a capable administrator, but he ran afoul of the clergy. When Charles V died, he was replaced by Charles V. That is, Charles the Foolish, he was called. There was a great deal of unrest, and there were attacks upon the Jews of Paris, and Provost Aubriot defended them and was criticized by the church for that. In fact, he was brought up on charges of heresy and so forth, and he was convicted and sentenced to death. He was spared death, but taken to the Bastille, where he would serve the rest of his life on just bread and water. Fortunately for him, there was a tax riot. The mob found their way in, and he escaped. But the first guest of the Bastille was the man who actually built it. Beginning in now we're up to the 16th century, the late 1500s, there were several guests of note. The great Montaigne, known as the philosopher of the French Revolution, was imprisoned there for all of 4 hours. He was sent there by the head of the Catholic League for not being sufficiently Catholic. And within 4 hours or so, he proved his Catholicism, apparently to the satisfaction. He was released. The Henri II de Bourbon, the Prince of Condé, was related to the king at the time, Henry IV, Le Bonnois, the Good King. Well, the Good King was also known as the Vert Galant, and he was a womanizer of epic proportions. He had eyes for Henry II's wife, Charlotte, and to escape her becoming one of Henry's mistresses, they escaped to Holland. But when they came back, they were imprisoned, or he was imprisoned for several years. And then somebody really worthy of imprisonment on the top right is Nicolas Fouquet, the deposed finance minister under Louis XIV. He was a man who lived large and at the public expense. below him is his chateau that he built, a magnificent home. And to inaugurate it, he had a party that ended all parties, at least for him. It was a fete that went all night. There were orchestras and floating gardens and fireworks and so forth. And it was attended, of course, by the king, which was Louis XIV, who was still in his regency, attended with his mother. And he was appalled at the profligate waste of money, hundreds of guests being served course after course on gilded plates. And he said to his mother, "This is just appalling. He's stealing above his station." Now, that tells you something about the ancien regime that somebody could say he is stealing above his station. Stealing apparently was all right, but within reason. Louis's mother said, "You know, dear, it's such a lovely evening. We're not going to arrest him right now. Let's wait until tomorrow." Well, tomorrow, or shortly thereafter, indeed, Fouquet was arrested, was taken to the Bastille, and then to a prison in the south of France where he spent the rest of his life, never to party on or appreciate his new home. So what was life like in the Bastille? Well, as they say, with money, you can live like a prince, without it, like a wretch. But you could say the same of life in Paris at that point. There's Voltaire on the left, living like a prince in rather commodious accommodations there. And there are some other depictions of cells and people being chained up. And there's the wretch at the bottom right. Well, as I said, how you were treated depended a great deal on how much money you had, where you came from, and what your offenses were for which you had been served a lettre de cachet. And in many cases, it's really not clear what the offenses were. It wasn't stipulated. And this, of course, was one of the things about the whole system that was so offensive, that there was no due process whatsoever. But what was life like within? Well, for many people, nobility, it was really quite comfortable. You could, for example, bring along a valet or a cook. You could bring your furniture. A prisoner named La Beaumelle had bookcases built and a private library of 600 volumes there. He took part in bowling, billiards, chess, and entertainment. A writer named Marmontel describes dinner with fine linens, tablecloth, silverware, good bread, and good wine. He said the soup was an excellent puree of white beans with the freshest butter, and the cod course was even better. Then came juicy beefsteak, boiled capon legs, streaming with gravy. Surely not everybody, or really nobody, was happy to be there, but for many people, it was kind of a country club prison. However, there are other accounts of people being covered with fleas, of bones sticking through walls, corpses wrapped in rags, and countless rats that surround and go over prisoners. A prisoner named Linguet said it was a place where existence is but a repetition of tortures worse than death. Fortunately, we have a lot of chronicles of what went on in the Bastille, and some of them are really actually a very good read. One of the first is by de Renville, who, as I had mentioned a moment ago, was ecstatic over the food. The food was said to be very good. There was a cook house. There was a private garden. The food was said to be excellent by many. And de Renville goes on about the oysters, the prawns, the fowls, capons, muttons, veal, every kind of fish, fruits in their season. Buquoy, who was not happy to be there, he called the Bastille the hell of living, said, however, it is the king's intention that everyone should be well fed. Claude Le Petit said that the Bastille was a place that makes everyone tremble. And on the right, we have the memoirs of Baroness de Staël. She was not to be confused with Madame de Staël of salon fame. But the Baroness de Staël was someone of great romantic escapades. She made many conquests within the prison, and she lived well. It's said that she held receptions in the afternoon and a salon at night. And when she left the Bastille, she had some sadness. She said, "My days in the Bastille were the happiest days of my life." But when it comes to prison literature, here we go. Here's the big four. These people virtually made a subset of French literature you might call prison lit. I'm speaking of Voltaire, Marquis de Sade, Linguet, and Latude. Now, Voltaire was really head and shoulders above the others here. He really doesn't need any introduction, except to say that he did 2 brief stints in the Bastille, the first for 11 months and the first for a couple of weeks. He did a lot of writing there. He actually wrote the book, The Man in the Iron Mask, when he was there. And he wrote a poem called La Bastille, in which he thanked the king for shelter and safety, food and freedom of movement. And it's said that when he went in to prison for that first stint, he went in as himself Francis Marie Arouet, a young writer who was getting into some trouble because of his wit and his politics. But he emerged as Voltaire. The second guest, Marquis de Sade. Now, it's said that if ever there were a reason to create the Bastille, de Sade was that reason, a living example of it. He really took the cake. He was imprisoned for just horrific behavior, for cruelty, for rape, for torture. And he was imprisoned, this is a distinction, under Louis XV, Louis XVI, Robespierre, and then under Napoleon. In fact, he was out of prison and thought that he'd curry favor with Napoleon. He sent him some of his writings. Napoleon was so horrified that he sent him back to prison. In fact, he ended up in a series of asylums where he continued to write and he wrote plays and staged them for public audience, in fact. He lived on to be 80 years of age, which is just remarkable for somebody who spent most of that time, or at least half of that time, imprisoned. There is an interesting story about de Sade and the Bastille. It's one of a number of prisons where he was held. Now, he was removed from the Bastille just 10 days before the storming of the Bastille in 1789, because he'd acted out. He was yelling out the window, "They're killing us all. There's a massacre. The governor is massacring us all. We're all being killed." And so he was removed to Vincennes, which was a tougher prison. And he was taken out of his cell, as he said, in the middle of the night, naked as a worm, and could take nothing with him. What he did not take with him was his writing, his masterpiece, which was 120 Days of Sodom. He'd been writing this for quite some time, and he had been writing on small pieces of paper that he glued together, and he rolled up into a scroll and stuck in a little chink in the wall of his cell. Now, it was left behind when he was taken, and he thought he would never see it again. In fact, to my knowledge, he never did. But there was someone who found the scroll, and it went through a series of hands for more than well over 100 years until 1904, when it was published by a German psychiatrist and sexologist who thought it was an important example of debauchery of the worst sort. And once again, de Sade was in the news, so to speak, and they said it was as if the walls of the prison were speaking yet again. Well, this scroll of de Sade's changed hands and for a great deal of money for the next century or so. And it wasn't until 2021 that the scroll was acquired by the Bibliothèque Nationale, which now has it in the archives. Next up is a real thorny kind of a creature. His name is Simon Nicolas Henri Linguet. And he wrote his memoirs of the Bastille. He was said to be a thorny character. He fought with everyone. He failed at everything. He failed at the law. He failed at the military. He failed at writing poetry and plays, in fact. But he did find himself in the Bastille for slander, and spent his time writing his memoirs of the Bastille, which are quite explicit, and they're described as the longest lie ever printed. In fact, it's not a good read. In the foreword, the editor suggests that you pretty much skip the first half. Now, you don't hear that often from an editor. In fact, the first half is all a self-aggrandizement about the great achievements of Linguet and how he does not deserve to be put in a place where he has to sleep on moth-eaten mattresses. But he said the food was plentiful, though he worried about being poisoned. He was released, but he insulted more people during the Reign of Terror, and he lost his head. Then comes Jean-Henri Latude. Now, in terms of prison list, Latude cannot be ignored. He was imprisoned early in life for a stupid youthful prank. He sent a package to Madame Pompadour, the chief mistress of Louis XV. It contained what would look like poison. It wasn't, but it was a scheme to gain her favor. He went to Madame Pompadour and told her that she would receive this, that her enemies were plotting against her. Well, it turned out there were no enemies. It was just Latude, and he was in prison. Now, his claim to fame, other than the fact that he spent 35 years behind bars for a stupid youthful prank, is that he escaped 3 times, once from the Bastille, twice from Vincennes. And the Bastille escape was accomplished through a ladder that he put together, a very long, like 200-foot ladder that he made with bed sheets and pieces of sheeting and his shirt and little pieces of wood. It's on display at the Musée Carnavalet. It's really quite remarkable. But he was a Zelig-like figure, or you might say kind of a Forrest Gump. He kept turning up, and he had chances to get out of the prison, and he seemed to have stepped on his own pathway to freedom. He wrote letters to the head of the prisons. He gained his favor. He gave the letter to someone to deliver. It was lost. It was found on the street by someone who read it and was so moved that she took up his case, and things moved along. He was released from prison, but told to leave Paris. He didn't leave, so he's thrown back in. And finally, he was championed by some of the members of the Academy, and he was released for good in 1784. And if you can imagine Latude leaving prison after 35 years, he then became a wealthy man and the toast of Paris. He was given several pensions. He was given restitution from the family, the survivors of Madame Pompadour, and he was invited to salons all over town. He was a ladies' man, a charmer, and a complete liar. Even his name, Latude, was made up. So let's set the stage for the storming of the Bastille. The Ancien regime had a strict class system. You're probably all well familiar with this. There were 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy; the second, the nobility, which was divided into noblesse d'épée, the nobles of the sword, who raised the army, and noblesse de robe, who had bought venal offices to do work for the monarchy. Then came the third estate, everyone else, the commoners, or 95% of the population of France. This included the bourgeois, the haut bourgeois, and the petit bourgeois, but also the mass of artisans, peasants, and the urban working poor. And everyone, it said, was frustrated and angry at the time of the revolution. The clergy was losing their power, the nobility was losing their opportunities in court, and the haut bourgeois were angry that they were not able to move up in society, and the artisans, the working poor, were under the pressure of lower wages and rising prices and a bread shortage. So the nation was up in arms and the regime was very much in decline. Louis XVI called together the Estates General to try and solve the problems of the economy and of the grain shortage. This led to the creation of the National Assembly. As we said, the issues of the day were poor crops and grain speculators and economic ruin. So the price of bread had escalated 2-fold, 3-fold. It got to the point where people simply could not feed their families, could not survive, and bread was the staple of the French diet. And so there were riots throughout the countryside, first before Paris, then a riot in Paris called the Réveillon riot. That's pictured right here. Now, Réveillon was a manufacturer of wallpaper, very wealthy, and he and another manufacturer were speaking at an assembly, and were heard to say that they wanted to stabilize the price of grain by eliminating the price being set at the perimeter of the city by the tax farmers, it was called. And they were misunderstood to say that they wanted to actually lower the wages of the workers. And this gave rise to an enormous outpouring of frustration of Réveillon's 300 workers. And they rioted and attacked his house, Now, ironically, Réveillon, seeing them come in the front door, went out the back door and went over to the Bastille to hide out, while the crowd ransacked his home, took everything out. And then when they were done with everything, they discovered down in the basin there were 6,000 bottles of wine in the cave, and they went at those to the point where the royal troops came in, fired on the crowd, went downstairs, found the remainder dead drunk, and arrested all of them. But this Réveillon riot, which happened in April of 1789, just a few months earlier, was said to be a curtain raiser on the revolution. The one difference is how the mob was regarded. They say, when you have a mob that is not successful, it's a failed insurrection and everyone is just out for loot. But when you have a mob that succeeds, it's a revolution and everyone is a hero. The Réveillon riots. Now, let's go to the timeline. Just a minute. Okay, the timeline of the siege, or La Prise de la Bastille. Within the month of June and into July, there was a massing of royal troops in Paris. And the reason was there was great unrest. And as I mentioned, there were a great many immigrants to the city. People were pouring into the city from the countryside, people desperate for food. And there were gangs that roamed the city with sticks, smashing in windows and attacking bakers and private homes and some, looking for something to eat. Well, three things happened in a week that absolutely changed the course of French history. We're now on Saturday, July 11th. The king, here's the provocation, the king dismissed Finance Minister Necker. He was very popular, Necker was, and he was considered the man who really had saved France by making a personal loan to save France. But Necker was dismissed and exiled out of the country, and a new cabinet was chosen by the king. That was the provocation. On Sunday, July 12th, there was the spark. Sunday was the day when Parisians gathered in the Palais Royal, an open garden. It's still there today, and it was owned by the Duc d'Orléans. And so, because it was private, the police could not go there, and it was a place of free speech. Well, it was on that day, the Sunday, July 12th, that Camille Desmoulins, as you see at the right, stood up on a table and addressed the crowd and urged them, aux armes, to arms. That was his speech at the Palais Royal on Sunday that turned the next day, Monday, into a day of searching for weapons. And the turning point throughout this was that the military had sympathies with the Parisians. It would not take up arms against them. But on Monday, there were a series of break-ins or raisings or of the garrisons at Maison de Saint-Lazare, the Garde Meuble, and people were in search of guns and in search of provisions of any sort. Any storing of flour is what they want. And also on this Monday, there was the choosing of the government basically was formed, the choosing of the electors, a military was created, and as a makeshift uniform, we have, if you see at the bottom here, the red hat and the cockade of the revolutionary. And Lafayette was put in charge of the military. The electors later soon became the permanent committee. So the new Paris had a structure to it. It had a military, and it tried to hold things together as the city was going crazy in search of arms and something to eat. The geography of the siege. Now let's look at Paris at the time of the revolution. There are four key places we're talking about. The first, in the first arrondissement, as it is now, was the Palais Royal, just outside the Louvre. Walking distance, but a good walk from there, was Rue Saint-Antoine, was Hôtel de Ville. And further down Rue Saint-Antoine is the Bastille. Those two structures are only about 8 or 10 blocks apart. Now, you can walk between all of these now. The Hôtel de Ville is a new Hôtel de Ville, but looks like the old one. The Bastille, of course, is not there. Further afield was the Invalides over on the right bank, in what's now the 7th arrondissement, where the guns were stored. And so, let's go now to the timeline of the siege. We're on July 14th, Tuesday. And the day begins at 6 a.m. with the sounding of the tocsin, calling citizens to arms. And the first place they went was Invalides. They went to Invalides to secure weapons. They massed there at 6 a.m., but by 10 a.m., they had broken into the Invalides. Actually, there was really no resistance, and they seized between 30 or 40 or maybe as many as 40,000 muskets. This was a crowd that was said to be as big as 40 to 80,000 people. In addition to muskets, they got 12 cannons. But importantly, here they got no resistance from the soldiers guarding the Invalides. They were called Invalides or wounded soldiers. Nor did they from the royal troops, which were camped virtually just right across the field. And at this point, the insurrection was assured. They had won the hearts and minds of the military who had come over to the side of the people. Now let's turn a little further afield to the Bastille. Unknown or not a part of this large crowd at the Invalides was a crowd of local people from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine who were massing at the Bastille in search of the ammunition that was there. At Invalides, there was no ammunition to be had, and the crowd there was told it's at the Bastille. So they headed over that way, but there was a separate crowd at the Bastille. Now that crowd begins around 10 a.m. We're at 10 a.m. At 10:30, the first deputation is sent to the Bastille from the Hôtel de Ville. In other words, the new Parisian there on the left, that's the Hôtel de Ville, where the Parisian new government was, and they sent a deputation over to the Bastille to tell the governor to surrender, to give to the people the ammunition that was, after all, theirs. Because they arrived about 10:30, the governor took them in and said, well, it's time for déjeuner. Why don't we sit and eat? So he invited them to lunch, and where they had one course after another and some wine, and nothing was happening. So at 11:30, a second deputation, the second of 4 deputations, was sent over to the Bastille. They made no progress in getting in. At 1:30, something happened. There was confusion. The defenders of the Bastille, which, let's look at them now, they consisted of 82 Invalid pensioners, old wounded soldiers who were aiding the governor. They were fortified by 32 Swiss guards who had come to shore up the defense. They had 32 small artillery and a lot of gunpowder. It had all been sent over there, 250 barrels of it, but they had only 2 days of food and no water source. So they had limited time. They were facing 900 workers from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, artisans, traders, shopkeepers, defected soldiers joined them. They had but 3 cannons, muskets, and pikes, and they were the ones who suffered perhaps 100 killed or wounded in the course of the day. We're up to 1:30. There was confusion as to whether or not the defenders of the Bastille were firing upon those getting into the outer courtyard. Those in the courtyard, the besiegers many were killed. And at that point, the whole nature of the confrontation changed. At 2 o'clock, we have the 3rd deputation to the Bastille. They made no progress. At 3 p.m., the 4th deputation to the Bastille. They made no progress. But at this point, we have the military coming. You didn't know there'd be sound effects here. A detachment of the Garde Françaises with cannons, led by a commander named Hulin, arrived at the Bastille, and this emboldened the crowd to move forward. There was an attempt around 5 o'clock at a negotiation. The governor of the Bastille sent out a little note. You see it, the letter, through a hole in the drawbridge there. In which he proposed that if given safe passage to himself and his troops, he would surrender the Bastille and it was all theirs. But at this point, because the crowd had felt he was such a traitor and had fired upon their people, there was no doing. And the standoff continued until 5:30, When the governor capitulated, seeing no way out, and he asked for the key, he opened the drawbridge, which opened, killed some insurgent right there because it fell on him. But in rushed all of the insurgents. They climbed through the towers and liberated all 7 prisoners, and they killed some of the defenders, and they took some as captive. But importantly, they took the governor Delaunay as a hostage, and they decided they would march him to the Hotel de Ville, where he would face justice. Well, as we said, he did not get there, and the angry crowd lashed out, and as he lashed out and killed him, stabbed him to death, beat him to death, and then cut off his head and took him to the Hotel de Ville. He was met there with another incident where the provost, Flessel, who was in charge of the Hotel de Ville and had not been forthcoming in providing weapons to the people, was also, he also met the same fate. He was killed by the crowd, had his head cut off, put up on a pike, and there you see the 2 heads of Delaunay, the governor, and Flessel, the provost of merchants, who was in charge of the Hotel de Ville. And from there, they marched to the Place Royale, where they partied on and sang the slogan, "The Bastille has fallen, its gates are open." And that went long into the night, or into the evening, let's say, until a great rain came along, and that was it for the day. They all went home. How do we know this? Well, there are accounts of this. One was by a besieger named J.B. Humbert, who was a clockmaker who claimed to be the first to rush in and climb to the top of the tower. The defenders, the Salade Regiment of the Swiss Guard, also kept a log of their experience. And there were various other reports that that surfaced in the newspapers shortly thereafter. Several things happened just after that, and I'm really just running through the events of the revolution. And they occurred the next day. The king was informed of what had happened. He considered removing his troops. On Thursday, he was brought to Paris, where he appeared before the National Assembly, and then he went to then the next day, on Friday, the 17th, he went to the Hotel de Ville, and he joined with the revolutionaries in putting a cockade onto his hat and pledging his allegiance to the revolution. Remember, the notion that France wanted to get rid of its king, it wanted the system to end, but the king was very popular, and there were cries during the siege of the Bastille, "Vive le roi!" And the idea of the king being part of the revolution was one that many people embraced. Not all, but many people did embrace. And so, at least for the time being, the king was part of it. And what happened to the Bastille? The government went over, the new government, and inspected it, but almost immediately it was just ransacked. And all of the records of the Bastille were thrown out of their offices, thrown on the floor, thrown out the window. They were considered to be the records of the police upon the people, the spies, and so forth. And they were all just thrown everywhere. And almost that week, why the demolition of the actual Bastille began. The fury was such that they simply wanted it removed from the face of the earth. Now, what was the effect of the siege? Well, a great many things happened. It was a local insurrection, but it became a national uprising, or a national revolution, in fact. It was said that the riots, the bread riots in the countryside, had emboldened the Parisians to attack the Bastille, but the success the Parisians had in taking the Bastille emboldened the countryside then to continue their uprising in eliminating the feudal system. And so the countryside, the peasants of the countryside rose up, destroyed chateaus, executed nobles, and they burned all the charters of feudalism. Now, in rapid fire, several things happened thereafter. On August 4th, the National Assembly abolished feudalism officially. On August 26th came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen that laid out the rights of the people. On October 5th, the Women's March to Versailles, in which the king and his family were brought to Paris to be part of the revolution and were kept pretty much under house arrest at the Louvre. Almost immediately, we begin with the mythologizing of the Bastille. And there were known to be about 900 or so conquerors, or vainqueurs de la Bastille. And they were given pensions. They were celebrated for their courage. And it's said that as late as 1870, some of these vainqueurs de la Bastille were still receiving pension, or their descendants were receiving pensions from the country. But they became part of the narrative of what happened in the revolution. As I said, the demolition contract went to a man named Palloy. He called himself Patriot Palloy. He was a builder who had something of a flair for self-promotion and marketing. He marketed pieces of the Bastille as relics of liberty and disseminated the apostles of liberty. Also part of this mythology were several dubious guests of the Bastille. The first was the man in the iron mask. Now, he surely was there, but who he was the subject of 6 or 8 or 10 different theories. Important to us is that when the Bastille was liberated, some claim that they found the skeleton of the masked man with the mask lying beside his skeleton. That was a bunch of bunk. He died in 1703, was buried. Mirabeau, who became one of the great voices of the revolution, called himself a martyr of the Bastille. He was never there. He was imprisoned early in his life, but not at the Bastille. And the biggest canard of all was a man named Comte de Lorge. He was said to be a man who had served 32 years in prison, and for no good reason. And when they liberated him, he was said to have this long white beard. You see that the beard grew as the legend did. He was taken out of the prison, and 10,000 Parisians say they saw him, and he was celebrated. There was a mask made of his face by Madame Tussaud, you see at the top right, and his memoirs were written. Problem is, he never existed. He was the creation of a revolutionary journalist who saw a value in creating a kind of a composite prisoner who had suffered great harm for decades for no good reason under the tyranny of the Ancien regime. Now, the commemoration of the Bastille took a long journey. It wasn't for another century that it actually was made into the holiday that we have today. It was celebrated the following year, but then came the king's flight to Varennes when he and his family tried to escape. He no longer believed in the revolution. He was tried and convicted and put to death. Then came the time of Robespierre and the Terror, and then a series of different governments until about 100 years later, France finally established the Third Republic. And under the umbrella of the centennial, there was renewed interest in creating a national holiday. Now, not everybody wanted that. The church was opposed to this godless holiday, and the anarchists wanted to celebrate Bloody Week and not this. But it was settled upon, and it became a nationally celebrated 14 Juillet. As for the space itself, it went through many different iterations. Originally, there was a fountain put there, in which a strange goddess surrounded by lions had 2 fountains. Water would shoot out from her breasts. That was replaced by an elephant under Napoleon, but the bronze elephant he envisioned was never made. And this filled up with rats and kind of disintegrated. That was removed. And the Colonne de Juillet was placed in the Place. And that is the commemoration that we see there today. How do we know really what happened at the Bastille? And this is where we end with the historiography of the Bastille. And there's another twist, and something that got hidden in the floorboards this time. When the Bastille was taken, its records were strewn all about. It was said that there were 600,000 records of former prisoners and all sorts of records of police spying and so forth. 600,000. They disappeared, but they turned up in the building you see at the lower right, the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. I was there. I couldn't find the door to get in. I must say it's a tough place. And a librarian there named Ravesson in 1866 looked under some floorboards and found those 600,000 documents of life in the Bastille going back hundreds of years. He exhumed them from underneath the actual floorboards. and spent the next 40 years or more putting them back into order. And there, once he did, or during that time, a German-born historian named Funk Brentano made sense of them, and he published a book called Legends of the Bastille that pretty much set straight the many calumnies and lies and legends and myths of the Bastille. This follows through to the historiography of the entire revolution, and that's a subject for another time or a whole lot of different times. And it's been a fascinating journey. Our journey ends here with the Bastille, an eternal symbol of triumph of the people over despotism. And I wish you all a joyeux 14 juillet. And we'll entertain any questions if we have any time left for it, Renee.
Thank you, Roger, so much for Myths and Mysteries of the Bastille that will definitely illuminate many of our celebrations at Alliance Française chapters around the US. Let me take a look in the chat here, and we have time for one or two questions, I think.
There was Renee, there was a great one. Somebody asked, to what extent was the explosive nature of France surrounding this event the result of debt incurred in support of the American Revolution and in anticipation of uprisings possibly in Haiti, for example?
Oh, excellent question. And yes, very much a problem. France was bankrupt. It was bankrupted by, by its history. It was bankrupted in particular by Louis XIV, who conducted endless wars and also made a very terrible economic mistake of rescinding the Edict of Nantes and forcing the Huguenots out of the country, and with them a great deal of the economy. That happened in the end of the 17th century, but the effect was felt for a long time. France's support for the American war was a major problem. It was supported because it was in effect a war against their great rival Britain, but it had very much bankrupted the country and had led to a terrible economic crisis that was complicated by several years of terrible crop yield. Now, wars and crops are very much interconnected. You can't fight a war without soldiers, and you can't have soldiers unless you take peasants out of the field. And that was essentially the role of the noblesse de l'épée. They were told to raise an army, so they grabbed all the young men and even boys, and they put a uniform on them, and they sent them off to fight for the king. Now, if a war works out, you've expanded your territory and your tax base. If it doesn't, you've killed off a lot of people, and there's nobody really to farm the fields and so forth. Now, there was great frustration at the expenditure that France had made. I'm not sure how many people in the countryside were aware of the expenditure or any of the financial doings of the Ancien regime, but certainly in Paris, it was a major issue.
Bryn, do you see another question that you think we should highlight in the few minutes that we have left?
I just had one question of those monstrous pictures of portrayals in the art of the Bastille. Do you think things would have been different if they hadn't destroyed the building and we actually could go there and visit the reality of the place?
I think they might have been entirely different. I think a lot of the Bastille, a lot of aspects of the Bastille would have been open to historians. If we had it there today, I think it'd be a major attraction. I've been to the Alcatraz prison, and that's great. That's a great trip. People would love to go into the Bastille. It would be a major moneymaker for France. And I don't know why the Paris Disneyland or Disney World didn't put, I don't know if they did recreate a Bastille, but it'd be a major attraction. But I think, yes, a lot of the secrets of the Bastille might have been revealed through modern technology. I mean, the fire at the Notre Dame has revealed a great deal about how that structure was actually constructed. And we've been able to look at weather patterns by looking at wood that's 800 to 1,000 years old, and looking at the tree rings and so forth. So yeah, buildings tell stories, and we can understand those stories in a way today that we couldn't have 50 or 10 or 50 or 100 years ago.
I'm sure people have other questions, but Roger's put together a fabulous bibliography that we will make available to everyone. So watch for that. And with that, Roger, thank you so much. This has just been phenomenal. a great lead into the holiday.
Well, thank you. It's been great to delve into this subject. And I must say, now that the 14 Juillet is here, I feel like I'm, in a sense, being released from the Bastille to enjoy a glass of wine right now. So I thank you
so much, Roger. I think everybody loved this presentation. We're very grateful. Bye-bye.